All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Sanson, and I'm with the Indiana Council for Economic Education, based here in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. And I am pleased that you have joined us on this first session of our annual Econ Camp. I'm really proud to partner with a few other organizations, universities across the region. Shortly, you'll hear from Dr. Daria Sebastianova from the University of Southern Indiana. Always appreciate their participation in our Econ Camp South down at Santa Claus, Indiana. And I'm also pleased to welcome Dr. David Purkis with the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, the Louisville branch. We'll hear more from Dr. Dave here in a couple of sessions that we're presenting next week. But these two organizations, along with the Purdue Center for Economic Education, have been partnering to present this annual Econ Camp. So I want to welcome everyone. This session today is going to take a look at the kind of the public policy, current events side of things, as we typically do at Econ Camp. So with no further delay, I want to turn it over to Daria, and let's go ahead and get going with our first session for Econ Camp.
Thanks, Jeff, and good afternoon and welcome to everybody. Thank you for attending. As Jeff has already mentioned, I'm an economics professor at the University of Southern Indiana, and I also serve in the role of the Center for Economic Education Director. I've been involved in the Camp Econ South at Santa Claus for a number of years now. It was always a wonderful experience, very well attended event. That said, I'm still glad that we're able to bring it back, albeit in a virtual format. We have to try. I think the pandemic has been a big learning experience for all of us in higher education specifically. And it's been quite the context within which to study economics, update our models, track evolving policy, and how the economy responds to those. So I just looked at some data for you guys, put some slides together. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. The first segment of my presentation is on fiscal policy. So of course, there's a lot to talk about, but this is a half-hour-long section. I invite you guys to interject if you deem that appropriate as questions come up, or use the chat function, please. And also we'll leave some time at the end to address any remaining questions. So first and foremost, the outline. First, I would like to motivate the extent of government spending that's been incurred in 2020 and 2021. Most substantial and timely stimulus. The full timeline will be explained next, and the implications on the US national debt will follow. So when thinking about the pandemic recession in general, it's interesting to compare it to the history of the business cycle in the US. It's unique in the sense that it was precipitated by what we would refer to as a natural disaster in our macroeconomic models, or a public health crisis specifically. So the impetus was the coronavirus. So that's unusual that an otherwise thriving, fully employed economy had to shut down and mitigate public health risks that way, with all of the safety measures that were implemented, with mobility restrictions, production stoppages. So an unusual situation that people that were able and willing to work were not allowed to do so. So an unusual recession, to say the least. Also the deepest since the Great Depression. If you look at the extent that output declined, we'll look at some graphs here throughout the presentation. Also the shortest by the official NBER designation, only lasting March and April 2020. Unlike prior recessions, the pandemic recession did not see a decline in manufacturing. Also, we saw households emerge in a strong financial position from this recession, or otherwise put, there were no movements in household debt. And that had to do, of course, to a great extent with the generous fiscal stimulus that was applied. Certain types of markets held up better than others, like the strong housing and stock markets also defy inflationary or recessionary trends that we've seen in the past through our business cycle history. Another unique feature is that the hardest hit was the high contact service sector. So low wage jobs, particularly held by women, by minorities. That was the most impacted sector. We're also seeing how unequal the effects of the recession have been on the basis of gender, race, sector, and also region. And those two, of course, are frequently connected. So I think when talking to students about stimulus, it's productive to first remind some of the basics, what fiscal policy actually does. So back to basics. It deals with taxation and government spending decisions. It's important to highlight that it takes time. We're certainly experiencing it, that it's a political process when these bills get proposed by politicians and ultimately enacted by Congress. That also, even after approval, that fiscal policy operates with a lag. So in that sense, we can contrast it to monetary policy. It deals with federal, state, and local government spending, but we also saw some very generous supports of households and businesses in this pandemic. So the households could meet expenses on necessities, and businesses could still pay their employees, is how these measures were implemented. Right away, we saw direct payments or stimulus payments of those $1,200 per household under a certain threshold, unemployment benefit top-ups, also tax breaks, paycheck protection program for businesses with fewer than 500 employees. And then it was those forbearance programs on mortgage and student debt that prevented foreclosures and bankruptcies, and also some supports for local governments in the form of school lunches, vaccination programs, and so on. So very broad-based, very generous fiscal package. The timeline goes back to March 2020, when 4 laws were enacted. This is typically referred to as the CARES Act. That was the most substantial part of that package. And the Paycheck Protection Program that was implemented within the CARES Act. So that law alone exceeded $2 trillion. Then some events played out when both parties presented their versions of what would be a second package. In May, Democrats presented the HEROES Act, and then Republicans shortly thereafter, they followed up with the HEALS Act. And then Democrats updated the original HEROES proposal. However, no agreement on that version of the second stimulus was reached in 2020. What did happen is the extension or some additional stimulus in the amount of $900 billion at the end of that year, so December 2020. Then with the new administration coming in, the American Rescue Plan was enacted in March. So that's another $1.9 trillion. These are the numbers that we're adding up here quickly. And that expanded unemployment benefits, provided additional direct payments, also child tax credits, and more school funding. Vaccine distribution efforts were part of this package, and so on. Then what we've been hearing about since May is the Build Back Better Biden plan. I like the alliteration, makes it easier to remember. And that too has a lot of components, from inequality to infrastructure. Climate change is a big portion of it as well. So far, the part of the Biden plan that enjoys bipartisan support is the infrastructure plan. So that is evaluated at about $1 trillion and has a climate change component to it as well. Besides infrastructure, healthcare and education are in focus of this new proposal. So dealing with Medicaid expansion, free community college, childcare, child tax credit, and the programs that would reduce poverty, inequality, and racial justice. So lots, from modernizing infrastructure to dealing with some major social implications for the US. Where this will end up is a big question. And its $3 trillion forum is unlikely to go anywhere. So the cost thus far will be anywhere between $1.5 and $3.5 trillion. Of course, we're up against the debt ceiling again in early December. So I probably would predict longer negotiations and further paring down of this Build Back Better plan. We will see. Back to CARES and ARP. So the two packages that have already been implemented, just to demonstrate the relative percentages of household payments for both. So pretty significant, a pretty significant explanation of why households are in a strong financial position with excess savings these days. So the benefits did play a big role in preventing people from falling into poverty, from loss of income, loss of unemployment, loss of housing. And so overall, less poverty and a good financial situation for American households these days. It was far from perfect. At the same time, Christina Romer has done some interesting work on efficiency of fiscal stimulus. There are also some other economists that came to the conclusion that many of these measures were not targeted enough. The biggest bang for the buck falls on some state and local government transfers that were implemented, as well as some social insurance programs like unemployment benefits and Medicaid expansion. Other than that, some people fell through the cracks. Not everybody received unemployment benefits. Not every business was financially sophisticated enough to receive paycheck protection programs, funds. There was a substantial variation across the states as well. Hunger did temporarily go up, especially in certain parts of the country. Of course, human capital was lost, which could have long-term implications on income inequality. We also saw that women were more likely to quit their jobs in order to care for children and assist with homeschooling during the pandemic. Some economists have gone so far as to say that women really are the social insurance in our society, that they have picked up the slack to a great extent and juggled. Of course, they were in the front line of the pandemic already due to being in these service occupations that were most vulnerable to the spread of the virus, and also had to step up and juggle all of their duties, all of their work duties, household chores, and child rearing at the same time. So the stimulus was far from perfect, but certainly large and timely. How is it paid for? Is by taxes or by borrowing. Another important basic concept to go over with your students when talking about the implications of fiscal spending and government debt. Also, the idea that the Fed purchased debt directly from the US Treasury to cover the majority of the spending is important to get across. So that certainly expedited policy, but made it perhaps more like what you would see in other countries, like developing nations where governments print money to finance their spending. In any case, we benefit from a low interest rate environment these days that reduce the real debt burden. Interest rates are expected to stay low for a while as a function in part of accommodating monetary policy, but also investors' appetite for safe assets. and also long-term low GDP growth trend that's projected. So high saving rate in developing countries and so on. So there are various explanations for why rates have been low and are likely to stay so in the near term. Where national debt is owned is by the public, and the second component is so-called intergovernmental holdings. So since it now stands at 125% debt to GDP ratio, 100% of that ratio is the public holdings, which is both domestic and foreign. So individuals, corporations, central banks, governments, about 37% is foreign held debt. And then the remainder, so 100 out of 125 was the public held debt, and then the remaining 25% is intergovernmental holdings, which is things like Social Security and retirement funds. There's some wonderful charts that one can find to illustrate these concepts. I find there's a lot of misperception, like, for example, our students, at least at the college level, find it to be the case. They feel like the Chinese own all of our debt. So it's usually important to get across the idea that most of it is actually held at home. Here's the graph that you can download from Fred. It's always a wonderful resource for your economic fundamentals. It's very visual how with the onset of the pandemic recession, our fiscal deficit spikes and begins to decline slightly. And of course, as we add more in terms of stimulus, we will see another uptick in this line. One point that's related to all of this discussion I wanted to get across here, I believe Ben Bernanke made that recently at a conference when discussing the pandemic economy, is that the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan were not truly stimulus packages in a conventional sense of fiscal stimulus. That they were there to hold people over while they could work. It truly was the type of spending that is investment into future growth. That's more like the current Biden plan that is in discussion stages. So simply to keep the economy from tanking completely, I don't know what a good word really here would be. It's not really stimulus in the conventional sense. It's just to hold us over until the pandemic subsides. And then anything additional that we will see going forward, any kind of spending on healthcare, education, infrastructure, poverty, inequality, that could perhaps be stimulus in the sense that those would be investments into future economic growth. Climate change is another important one I forgot to mention. But the spending that we saw in the pandemic was just implemented to support households and businesses through a very difficult time. And I don't think that was half an hour, was it? But we are at the end of our first session. I would like to invite any questions that you guys may have at this point.
We just thank you for that first session. Fantastic. As a kind of a closure to this, you can send, we're going to have a link provided. So if you show portions of this or all of it to your students, or you want to send more questions, we've got a form that questions can be submitted, and then those will be answered as they come in. So we're looking, forward to being able to share this information, both in terms of your knowledge of teaching these topics, but some things that maybe your students can delve into, either in its entirety or in portions. So thanks very much.